The Hegemony's council chamber aboard Station Omega Prime had witnessed many ridiculous spectacles in its 3-century history, but today promised to break new ground in the field of bureaucratic absurdity. The chamber itself was a monument to interspecies compromise, which is to say, it managed to be simultaneously too hot, too cold, too bright, and too dim for every species present. The architects had clearly believed that if everyone was equally uncomfortable, they'd reach decisions faster. This theory had proven spectacularly wrong, as most council sessions now resembled elaborate forms of mutual torture disguised as democracy. Ambassador Halo sat in the defendant's chair, a piece of furniture that had apparently been designed by someone who'd heard vague descriptions of chairs but had never actually seen one. She maintained her composure with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent 5 years explaining human customs to beings who considered breathing an optional life function. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a regulation diplomatic knot, though a few rebellious strands had escaped to frame her face. Her uniform bore the crisp lines of Earth's diplomatic corps, though the fabric showed the subtle wear patterns of someone who'd learned that sometimes you had to choose between looking perfect and actually getting things done. The charges against humanity today were, in the grand tradition of galactic politics, both monumentally serious and utterly ridiculous. Violation of the sacred nursery protocols, they called it. Theft of Vorthak war cubs. Corruption of apex predator juveniles through exposure to primitive mammalian bonding practices. The paperwork alone had required 17 different translation matrices and a team of xenolinguists who'd needed therapy afterward. Prex took the floor first, his crystalline form refracting the chamber's harsh lighting into prismatic displays that would have been beautiful if they weren't accompanied by his voice. A sound like wind chimes being strangled. "The evidence against the human representative is overwhelming," he declared, consulting a data tablet that was probably more intelligent than half the species in the room. 3 Vorthak cubs, designated as priority genetic assets under Hegemony Law 447.3b, were removed from their designated caregiving facility without proper authorization forms, impact assessments, or species-appropriate handling certifications. Halo bit back her first 17 responses, all of which would have resulted in her immediate expulsion from the station. Instead, she settled for a diplomatic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Prex, with all due respect, I think you might be missing some rather crucial context." "Context is irrelevant when protocols have been violated," Nex interjected from her section of the chamber. The hive mind representative spoke through a biomechanical interface that made her voice sound like a swarm of angry bees had learned. "Parliamentary procedure. We have invested considerable resources in maintaining proper nursery environments for dangerous species. Your interference threatens the stability of our entire child-rearing infrastructure." Commander Pax slammed his armored fist against his speaking podium, producing a sound like thunder trapped in a metal box. The ironclad military representative stood nearly 3 meters tall, his exoskeleton bearing the scars of a dozen campaigns and the decorations of someone who'd never met a problem he couldn't solve with superior firepower. "The human has stolen weapons," he growled. "Living weapons. This is an act of war disguised as childcare." Halo rubbed her temples, feeling the familiar headache that accompanied any attempt to reason with beings who viewed the universe through the lens of their own very specific neuroses. "They're not weapons, Pax. They're children. Traumatized, abandoned children who were left to die in a derelict facility because your precious breeding collectives decided they weren't optimal specimens." The chamber erupted in what passed for outrage among species that communicated through everything from pheromone clouds to controlled electromagnetic pulses. Halo had learned to read the room's mood by the particular combination of chittering, harmonics, and subsonic rumbles that filled the air. Today's symphony was playing in the key of sanctimonious indignation, with undertones of willful ignorance. She thought back to 6 months ago, when she'd first encountered the cubs on Outpost Charlie 7. The station had been officially decommissioned, its automated systems failing one by one in the kind of slow-motion catastrophe that galactic bureaucracy seemed designed to create. She'd been there investigating reports of unusual energy signatures, which, in diplomatic speak, meant something weird is happening and we need someone expendable to check it out. What she'd found instead were 3 Vorthak juveniles, each roughly the size of an Earth elephant, huddled together in what had once been the station's mess hall. Their obsidian scales were dull with malnutrition, their normally bright amber eyes clouded with fear and confusion. Blaze, the largest, had positioned himself protectively over his smaller companions, his muscular frame trembling with exhaustion. Fury had been curled into a tight ball, her usually expressive tail spines drooping with despair. And Storm had been barely breathing, their smaller frame racked with the kind of anxiety that came from trauma too deep for words. The Cubs' caretakers had simply left when funding for the facility was cut. No evacuation protocols, no transfer procedures, no consideration for the living beings in their care. Just a notice posted on the station's communication board. Facility non-operational, personnel reassignment, effective immediately. Halo had found that notice while searching for some explanation of how 3 apex predator juveniles had been abandoned like unwanted furniture. The bureaucratic callousness of it had made her angrier than she'd been since her first day as an ambassador, when she'd learned that diplomatic immunity didn't actually protect you from having your hotel room searched by paranoid security forces. The sacred nursery protocols, Prex continued, apparently oblivious to Halo's growing irritation, exist to ensure proper species-appropriate development of dangerous juveniles. Humans lack the necessary understanding of Vorthak psychology to provide adequate care. Adequate care? Halo stood, her diplomatic composure finally cracking around the edges. Your adequate care left 3 children to starve to death in an abandoned station. When I found them, they hadn't eaten in 4 days. 4 days, Prex. How exactly does that align with your precious protocols? Nex's biomechanical interface buzzed with the sound of rapid data processing. Facility decommission procedures are clearly outlined in subsection 23.7 of the Nursery Management Guidelines. All biological assets should have been transferred to alternate locations. Should have been, Halo repeated, but weren't. Because somewhere between your guidelines and reality, 3 living beings became line items on a budget report that nobody wanted to take responsibility for. The chamber fell into the particular kind of silence that happened when bureaucrats were confronted with the gap between their theories and actual consequences. It was an uncomfortable quiet, filled with the subtle sounds of species trying very hard not to acknowledge uncomfortable truths. Commander Pax broke the silence with his characteristic subtlety. Regardless of past oversights, the Cubs must be returned to proper Vorthak supervision. They are genetically engineered apex predators. In the wrong hands, they represent a significant security threat. Halo was about to respond when the chamber's massive doors, designed to withstand everything from plasma bombardment to diplomatic tantrums, suddenly buckled inward with a sound like reality taking a sick day. The reinforced metal groaned, twisted, and finally surrendered to forces that shouldn't have existed outside of theoretical physics textbooks. 3 forms burst through the ruined entrance with the fluid grace of natural predators and the dramatic timing of beings who understood exactly how to make an impression. Blaze led the charge, his obsidian scales now gleaming with health and vitality, amber eyes burning with intelligence and purpose. Behind him came Fury, her movements precise and deadly, tail spines raised in a display that would have been threatening if not for the way she immediately oriented herself toward Halo's position. Storm brought up the rear, smaller than the others but moving with the controlled intensity of a coiled spring. The council chamber, which moments before had been filled with the pompous rhetoric of galactic politics, suddenly became very, very quiet. Security alarms began wailing in 17 different harmonic frequencies, and automated defense systems tried to decide whether they were facing an invasion, a natural disaster, or something that didn't fit into any of their pre-programmed categories. The three Vorthak cubs ignored the chaos entirely. They moved through the chamber like they owned it, past scrambling council members and frozen security personnel, until they reached Halo's position. Then, in a display that would be analyzed by xenopsychologists for decades to come, they arranged themselves around her chair in a protective formation and sat down. Blaze positioned himself directly in front of Halo, his massive form creating an effective barrier between her and the council. Fury took the left flank, her attention focused on the chamber's various exits and potential threats. Storm settled to Halo's right, close enough that she could reach out and touch the young Vorthak's scales. And then they did something that sent shockwaves through every assumption the Galactic community had made about Vorthak behavior, child development, and the nature of interspecies relationships. They sat quietly. No roaring, no displays of dominance, no attempts to establish territorial control through intimidation. They simply positioned themselves as guardians and waited, their amber eyes fixed on the council members with the patient attention of beings who understood exactly what was at stake. Halo reached over and gently scratched behind Fury's ear fin, a gesture that would have been suicidal with wild Vorthak, but which the cub accepted with a pleased rumble that vibrated through the chamber floor. "Gentlemen, ladies, and collective consciousnesses," she said, her voice carrying the particular tone of someone who just played a winning hand in the galaxy's most important poker game. "I believe you wanted to discuss custody arrangements." The immediate aftermath of the cub's entrance could best be described as organized panic, if one was feeling generous about the organized part. Council members who had spent centuries debating the finer points of interstellar law suddenly found themselves face to face with the living embodiments of their worst bureaucratic nightmares. Species that had evolved complex social hierarchies based on careful positioning and ceremonial displays were now scrambling over each other like students fleeing a pop quiz they hadn't studied for. Prex's crystalline form rang like a wind chime in a hurricane as he vibrated with what his species considered fear, though it sounded more like someone was torturing a xylophone. He had retreated to the far corner of his speaking platform, his prismatic surface reflecting fractured images of the cubs that made them appear to multiply into an army of obsidian guardians. "Security!" he managed to chime out between resonant tremors. "We require immediate intervention protocols." Commander Pax, to his credit, hadn't moved from his position, though his armored plating had shifted into what his species called tactical readiness. Essentially the equivalent of a very dangerous turtle deciding whether to retreat into its shell or charge. His various weapon systems were undoubtedly running threat assessments and coming up with results that roughly translated to problems beyond current pay grade. High Matron Nex had the opposite problem. Her hive mind collective was experiencing what could only be described as bureaucratic paralysis, as thousands of linked consciousnesses tried to process the unprecedented situation simultaneously. The result was a biomechanical interface that kept starting to speak, stopping, recalibrating, and starting again. The protocols, but the documentation, however the regulations, she managed, sounding like a computer trying to divide by zero while maintaining proper parliamentary procedure. Through it all, Halo remained perfectly calm, one hand gently stroking Fury's neck scales while the other rested on Storm's flank. The cub's presence had transformed her from a defendant in an impossible trial into something far more dangerous, a diplomat with actual leverage. "Perhaps," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned to project calm authority while surrounded by barely controlled panic, "we could dispense with the security alerts. As you can see, Blaze, Fury, and Storm are perfectly well behaved." Captain Echo materialized from whatever corner of the station she'd been monitoring the proceedings from. Her security team spread out in what they probably thought was a tactical formation, but which looked more like a semicircle of beings trying to decide whether they were supposed to arrest 3 juveniles who could theoretically punch through the station's hull plating. Echo herself was a veteran of more diplomatic incidents than most people had hot dinners. and her expression suggested she was rapidly calculating the odds of this situation ending without requiring her to file paperwork that would take weeks to complete. "Ambassador," Echo said carefully, "station regulations require that any unscheduled arrivals be processed through proper channels." Halo glanced down at Storm, whose amber eyes were fixed on the security captain with the kind of patient attention that suggested the young Vorthak was learning everything there was to know about Echo's body language, tactical positioning, and probable intentions. "I'm sure they do, Captain. Of course, station regulations also probably have something to say about forcibly detaining beings who haven't actually committed any crimes." "Crimes?" Prex's harmonic voice cracked with indignation. "They destroyed council property! Those doors were rated for military-grade assault." Blaze turned his massive head toward the Zephyrite representative, and Prex immediately fell silent. It wasn't a threatening gesture. The cub simply looked at him, with the kind of mild interest one might show toward an unusual insect. But the effect was immediate and profound. Prex discovered that being the focus of an apex predator's attention, even friendly attention, was an experience his crystalline nervous system wasn't equipped to handle. "Actually," Halo continued conversationally, "I think you'll find that those doors opened in response to an emergency override code. The Cubs didn't break anything. They just used proper authorization protocols." Commander Pax's armored head swiveled toward her with mechanical precision. "Impossible. Emergency codes are classified military intelligence." Halo agreed. "They are. I taught them to the Cubs last week, along with about 40 other useful pieces of information that might come in handy during diplomatic emergencies." The silence that followed this revelation was the kind that usually preceded either breakthrough negotiations or complete civilizational collapse. It was broken by High Matron Nex, whose biomechanical interface had finally managed to establish a coherent connection with her collective consciousness. "You taught military secrets to foreign nationals," she buzzed accusingly. "This is espionage of the highest order." "Foreign nationals?" Halo's eyebrows rose in an expression of polite confusion. "That's an interesting perspective, Nex. According to the documentation you filed with this hearing, Blaze, Fury, and Storm are priority genetic assets, essentially property of the Vorthak breeding collectives. Property can't commit espionage, can it? That would require them to be recognized as individuals with the capacity for independent thought and action." The trap was elegant in its simplicity, and Halo could see the moment when the council members realized they'd walked directly into it. If the Cubs were property, as the collectives insisted, then they couldn't be held responsible for learning classified information. If they were individuals capable of espionage, then they had rights under interstellar law that included the right to choose their own guardians. Either way, the Council's case began to look increasingly like an exercise in creative legal fiction. Fury chose that moment to demonstrate her own understanding of the situation by rising from her position and walking over to Prex's platform. The Zephyrite representative made a sound like breaking glass as the young Vorthak approached, but Fury's intentions were entirely benign. She simply sat down in front of his platform and looked up at him with the kind of patient expectation that suggested she was waiting for him to do something interesting. "She's not threatening you," Halo explained helpfully. "She's just curious. Fury has never seen a crystalline life form before. She's wondering if you'll change colors when you're excited." Prex's prismatic surface promptly shifted through several shades of what could only be described as panicked rainbow. Fury tilted her head, made a pleased rumbling sound, and settled down to watch the light show with the focused attention of a child discovering television for the first time. "This is unacceptable," Commander Pax declared, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Vorthak Cubs are engineered weapons. They cannot be allowed to form emotional attachments to foreign species." "Engineered weapons?" Storm spoke for the first time, their voice carrying the peculiar harmonic qualities that marked them as Vorthak, but with inflections that were purely their own. "Is that what you think we are?" The chamber fell silent again. In all the centuries of Vorthak interaction with the Galactic community, no one had ever heard a juvenile speak during formal proceedings. The breeding collectives insisted it was impossible. Cubs lacked the cognitive development for complex communication until they reached their third growth phase. Storm rose gracefully from their position beside Halo and walked to the center of the chamber, moving with the kind of controlled precision that spoke of careful training and natural intelligence. "We are not weapons," they continued, their voice growing stronger. "We are not property. We are not genetic assets or priority specimens or any of the other convenient labels you use to avoid acknowledging what we actually are." "And what?" Commander Pax asked carefully. "Do you think you are?" Storm looked at him with eyes that held far more wisdom than any juvenile should possess. "We are children who were thrown away when we inconveniently developed personalities. We are individuals who learned that love and loyalty are not signs of weakness, despite what your collectives taught us. We are beings who chose our own family when the one assigned to us proved inadequate." Blaze and Fury had moved to flank Storm, their protective formation now clearly deliberate rather than instinctive. The three cubs presented a united front that was both undeniably powerful and utterly calm. "You want to know why we chose Halo?" Fury asked, her voice carrying the musical quality that made Vorthak communication so distinctive. "Because when she found us dying in an abandoned station, she didn't see weapons or assets or problems to be solved. She saw three scared children who needed help. She taught us that strength doesn't come from intimidation," Blaze added, his deeper voice rumbling through the chamber. "She showed us that intelligence includes emotional understanding, not just tactical analysis. She proved that family is something you choose, not something you're assigned." The cubs' testimony was devastating precisely because it was so matter-of-fact. They weren't pleading their case or appealing for sympathy. They were simply stating facts with the kind of confidence that came from beings who had found their place in the universe and weren't about to be talked out of it. Halo watched the council members struggle with this unprecedented situation. Their entire legal and social framework was built on the assumption that different species were fundamentally incompatible, that successful interspecies relationships required careful management by qualified professionals, and that children, especially dangerous children, needed institutional care rather than individual attention. The cubs had just proved every one of those assumptions wrong, and they'd done it by simply being themselves. "This changes nothing," Prex declared, though his harmonic resonance suggested he knew it changed everything. Protocol 847B clearly states that dangerous juveniles must be maintained in species-appropriate facilities under qualified supervision. "Qualified supervision," Storm repeated thoughtfully. "Like the supervision that led to us being abandoned without food or water. Like the qualified professionals who decided we were defective because we formed emotional bonds with our handlers." "The collectives have procedures," High Matron Nex insisted. "Established protocols for dealing with problematic specimens." Problematic. Fury's tail spines rippled with what Halo recognized as barely controlled anger. "Yes, we were problematic. We cried when our handlers were rotated out. We refused to participate in combat simulations against each other. We wanted to learn about things that weren't related to warfare or genetic optimization." "Highly problematic," Blaze agreed, his tone suggesting he understood the irony perfectly. "We displayed curiosity, empathy, and individual preferences. Clearly signs of defective programming. The cubs had turned the council's own language against them with surgical precision, and the effect was devastating. Every argument for their return to the collectives became an argument for their right to choose alternative care. Every protocol designed to control them became evidence of systematic abuse. Captain Echo had been quietly observing the proceedings, and now she stepped forward with the weary expression of someone who'd seen enough bureaucratic disasters to recognize when it was time to cut losses. "If I may," she said diplomatically, "it seems to me that we have three individuals who are clearly capable of making their own decisions about their living arrangements, whatever legal frameworks we're operating under. We can't ignore the evidence of our own eyes." Evidence of our own eyes, Commander Pax repeated slowly. You mean the evidence that 3 apex predators have chosen to obey a single human female? That they've learned classified military information and demonstrated tactical awareness beyond their supposed cognitive development? That they've somehow acquired individual personalities despite genetic programming designed to prevent exactly that? Yes, Echo said simply. That evidence. The chamber fell into contemplative silence as the implications of the situation began to sink in. The Cubs had done more than challenge bureaucratic procedures. They'd shattered fundamental assumptions about intelligence, development, and the nature of interspecies relationships. And they'd done it all while sitting quietly beside their chosen guardian, proving their point not through violence or intimidation, but through the simple revolutionary act of being exactly who they chose to be. Halo stood slowly, her hand still resting on Storm's flank, and addressed the chamber with the measured tone of someone who'd been waiting months to tell this particular truth. You want to know what really happened? She asked, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet chamber. The Vorthak breeding collectives have been systematically producing traumatized, aggressive offspring for decades. Their efficient breeding programs strip away everything that makes these beings individuals, then discard the ones who inconveniently develop personalities. She gestured toward the Cubs, who remained perfectly still but alert. Blaze, Fury, and Storm weren't abandoned because of budget cuts. They were thrown away because they formed emotional attachments to their handlers, because they showed empathy during combat training, because they asked questions that weren't in the approved curriculum. Prex's crystalline form resonated with disbelief. The collective's methods are scientifically validated. Are they? Halo interrupted, producing a datapad that made several council members shift uncomfortably. Because I've spent 6 months analyzing the collective's success rates. 70% of their graduates require constant behavioral modification drugs. 40% suffer from chronic aggression disorders. And nearly 20% become so unstable they have to be retired. The euphemism hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Everyone in the chamber knew what retired meant when applied to dangerous apex predators. The Cubs you see before you represent everything the collectives claim is impossible, Halo continued. They're emotionally stable, intellectually curious, and capable of forming lasting bonds across species lines. They're also, by your own metrics, the most psychologically healthy Vorthak juveniles in recorded history. Storm lifted their head slightly, amber eyes scanning the council members with quiet dignity. We remember our clutchmates, they said softly. We remember watching them become hollow, angry creatures who knew only violence and fear. The handlers called it proper development. We called it death. Fury's tail spines rippled once, a controlled expression of remembered pain. They told us that caring about others was weakness, that individual thoughts were dangerous, that our purpose was to serve, not to live. But you tried to live anyway, Halo said, her voice gentle. And when the collectives decided you were defective for having hearts and minds of your own, they simply disposed of you. The accusation struck the chamber like a physical blow, and the silence that followed was deafening. Commander Pax's patience finally shattered like his armored composure. Enough of this sentimentality, he growled, his weapon systems humming to life. Captain Echo, deploy sedation protocols. These assets will be returned to proper custody immediately. The response was instantaneous and terrifying in its restraint. Blaze rose slowly, his obsidian scales seeming to drink in the chamber's light until he appeared to be carved from living shadow. Fury and Storm flanked him, their movements synchronized with the fluid precision of beings who had trained together since birth. But they didn't attack, didn't roar, didn't display the explosive violence everyone expected from apex predators. Instead, they simply stood. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop several degrees as 3 pairs of amber eyes fixed on Commander Pax with absolute attention. The Cub's presence filled the space like a held breath, like the moment before lightning strikes, like the pause between heartbeats when the universe decides whether to continue existing. Every security officer in the room suddenly remembered that their training had never covered situations where the weapons were also the witnesses, the evidence, and the jury. Captain Echo's hand froze halfway to her command interface. In 30 years of security work, she'd learned to recognize the difference between beings who couldn't hurt you and beings who chose not to. The Cubs radiated the kind of controlled power that made experienced soldiers reconsider their career choices. "Stand down," she said quietly, though whether she was addressing her security team or Commander Pax wasn't entirely clear. Pax's armor registered the Cub's biometric readings and helpfully informed him that he was facing 3 individuals whose stress levels remained perfectly normal despite his threat. They weren't afraid. They weren't angry. They were simply waiting to see if the adults in the room were capable of making intelligent decisions. The Cub's quiet dignity in that moment spoke louder than any roar could have.